Hello, and welcome to another Fireside Chat with Jorbs. Been a while since I had a Fireside Chat just about Slay the Spire strategy, I think, but I wanted to talk about the challenge in deciding when to take cards that aren't good yet in Slay the Spire. This is a large part of where I spend my energy investigating the game these days. Um, And it's a really tough question because it really feels like I have to play like 100 runs with some new strategy before I get a good sense of what the strategy actually does. Um, we're thinking about something like taking Dark Embrace on floor 1, for example. If I'm used to taking Dark Embrace sometime in the second half of Act 1 or Act 2 at the earliest, and then I start taking Dark Embrace on floor 1, that drastically changes a lot of other things about how the Ironclad card pool performs. Um, and I'm not necessarily going to know all of those immediately when I start taking Dark Embrace on floor 1. And so over the course of time, as I try to practice doing that, I'm going to start realizing that it means that certain synergy packages are better or worse than usual. I'm going to start recognizing that some cards are better than usual and some cards are worse than usual, and may even start taking those cards before I'm being offered a Dark Embrace if I'm now in a situation where, like, well, it's floor 2, I haven't seen a Dark Embrace yet, but I know that if I'm offered one on floor 6, I will take it, and as such, I actually think Intimidate's a much better card than I used to think it was. Things like that start happening when you start trying to take a card like Dark Embrace on floor 1, and it takes a very, very long time before you start feeling really comfortable with how this is overall shifting your evaluations of a tremendous number of other cards and sub-strategies in an Ironclad run. So, that's the puzzle here. I would say that Slay the Spire is about solving immediate problems in a way which allows you to solve future problems. I think that that's the crux of the game and something that I find really interesting about playing Slay the Spire. In Slay the Spire, your deck is constantly being tested by hallway, elite, and boss enemies, so you need to constantly be taking cards which are good against the upcoming fights. But the game's pretty long, so if you're solving all of your problems in Act 1 in a way which is only good in Act 1, and then having to play Act 2, 3, and 4 afterwards, you may be hamstringing yourself to a point where overall solving Act 1 that way actually lowered your chance overall to win the run because you are so far away from solutions which work well for later in the run. As a hypothetical example, you could think about Iron Wave versus Clothesline as damage cards in Act 1, where Iron Wave has flat numbers on it, deals 5 damage and blocks for 5, which is great. And Clothesline has a debuff on it, which scales over the course of the run. So weakening something reduces how much damage it deals to you by a larger and larger amount as the run goes on. On floor 4, it might only reduce the damage that's incoming by 3 or something, whereas on floor 56, you might find that it's reducing the damage by 30. So there are lots and lots of decisions like that in Slay the Spire where it can be very difficult to decide exactly which thing you need to be prioritizing at different times in the run. And it's very unclear exactly what happens as you change your mind on which thing to focus on. When should you sacrifice current strength for later strength? So it's really hard to answer this question because, one, you are comparing immediate advantage to long-term advantage. It's relatively easy to say this reduces my chance to die in Act 1 by 5%. I would say that's a fairly simple pro-con analysis. You can do some math. You can look at how your deck lines up against different fights, and you can realize taking a particular card reduces the damage incoming in different places by different amounts. Maybe it increases your chance of killing Gremlin Knob by turn 4 by some percentage, so on and so forth. And you can estimate that it reduces your chance to die in Act 1 by some amount. But it's much harder to confidently say that it increases your chance to die later in the run by more than that. This is a thing that you are having to know a lot about Slay the Spire to even have any sort of confident estimate on. Um, and because your estimate of what it does is reliant on an understanding of a contrafactual strategy in Slay the Spire that you don't necessarily have any experience playing, your ability to compare what happens in your strategy to what happens in the other strategy, which you're not tending to choose, may be extremely limited. What I mean by that is if I don't have a great idea of what Ironclad runs are like, if I skip Act 1 damaged commons a lot and try to build combo decks, then I'm not going to necessarily have a great idea of what the downside is of taking an extra one or two Act 1 Ironclad commons. And the game's very complex, so it's just very, very, very hard to say what a decision on floor 3 does over the course of the next 53 floors with a lot of confidence every time. That's just hard to do. So yeah, number 2, why it's so hard to answer this question. Because of the length of the gameplay in question, all sorts of other variables influence your answer, and some of them are outside of the realm of simple Slay the Spire strategy, which is tricky. One of them, for example, is how likely are you to make mistakes? You may be more inclined toward a more complex strategy if you are more interested in calculating very deeply over the course of a run, and less inclined toward a simpler strategy. Another big question, what strategies are you using in Act 2, 3, and 4? You may have the opinion that going for infinite strategies in Ironclad are very good. You may have the opinion that going for strength strategies is very good. You might think that Snecko Eye is something that you almost always want to be taking, or you might think that it's something you almost never want to be taking. You might think Dead Branch is the best relic on the character, or might think that Dead Branch is usually a skip on the character. There are a tremendous number of different beliefs that you can hold about how Ironclad runs develop, which are all going to change the answer to what happens if I make this decision on floor 3 over the rest of the run, because you're playing the rest of the run differently. Another thing that's very, very hard to evaluate is, say you take one more damage card. Maybe that means you get one more upgrade in Act 1, or it means you get to fight one more elite in Act 1, resulting in rewards from another elite fight, or something like that. It's hard to judge like which effect it's going to have to begin with. I would say that judging what's going to happen in Act 1 if I take one more damage card versus if I don't is like one of the simplest things to do in all of this analysis, but it's still hard to say with absolute confidence, and there's a ton of variance involved in am I getting another potion or not, you know. My pathing is not necessarily going to be decided solely by this decision that I'm making on floor 3 or 4. But then, even among those things, if you do get another elite fight out of this extra common attack that you might be taking, for example, is the relic that you're getting from that actually worth it? That's hard to say, and that in turn depends on all sorts of things like how you think Act 2, 3, and 4 tend to develop. It requires looking at the entire relic pool and getting a sense for which relics are good and which ones are bad, and what percentage of the time you get a good one or a bad one. Or just relying entirely on intuition, which like is fine, but well, that doesn't solve the game. We rely on our intuition and on heuristics for playing Slay the Spire all the time, but one problem is that our intuition isn't necessarily right, can be anchored to beliefs that we have from the past, which we have trouble distancing ourselves from. And another problem is that our intuition kind of definitionally is going to be about how we think the game should be played, which means that our intuition about contrafactual worlds in Slay the Spire is probably not going to be that great. Our intuition about what taking Clothesline does, given that we believe that we should be taking Snecko Eye as a boss relic almost every time that we're offered it, is going to be different from our intuition about what Clothesline would do if we thought that we shouldn't take Snack Away every time that we were offered it, um, given that we haven't actually tried playing the game in a way that doesn't involve taking Snack Away almost every time it's offered on Ironclad ever. So that's all really tricky. This is a very, very tricky decision to be making, to be evaluating with much effectiveness. Here's some examples of long-term decision making. One is removing a card in the shop versus buying a potion to help with an elite fight. I think this is kind of like the cleanest example to me of choosing long-term decision making over short-term decision making in Slay the Spire runs. And because of all the stuff I've been saying about like it being very hard to have sensible intuition about what happens if you do the other thing, I recently spent like pretty much a full year of my time playing Slay the Spire, trying very hard to focus on long-term decision making in Act 1. What happened was I noticed that I had reached the heart every time in my last 30 runs or something at some point, and I was like, you know, I'm taking a lot of decisions that are really good for Act 1 right now. I'm successfully building decks that are making it to late game, but I'm not winning late game every time. And the strategies that I'm arriving at in late game are based on me having like several cards in my deck that were good in Act 1 and having spent money on potions and relics, which are good in Act 1 and stuff like that. So I'm curious if perhaps I'm aiming for the wrong strategies late game just because I'm so focused on early game. And I wonder what would happen if I tried focusing more on late game, accepted that I'm going to lose some runs in Act 1, sure, whatever. I'm not necessarily saying that I thought that I was making the best plays here, but what was really interesting for me to investigate was if I am willing to sacrifice some chance to win the run in Act 1, what do I end up doing with that in late game? What sorts of decks do I arrive at? Is there some synergy package that starts to really shine for me that I was overlooking before because I was taking a lot of Act 1 commons and stuff like that? And what I personally found playing Ironclad like this was that Dark Embrace was just far, 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 far more powerful than I had been giving credit to it for, than I had been crediting it for, whatever, something like that. As one example of a thing that I realized about how I was changing my strategies and what I was seeing succeed when I changed those strategies. There were some other things too. I found that Dropkick and Blood for Blood, for example, were really good damage cards. I also found that like stuff like Disarm, which I had valued incredibly highly, just wasn't as valuable when I could make a deck that was extremely powerful late game. It didn't matter quite as much that I had one extremely good moderate strength block card that had moderate strength scaling because I was frequently assembling decks which were like killing things on turn 1 or blocking for 999 block or scaling immense amounts of strength with Reaper or, you know, just doing something stronger than what Disarm did. So, that was a very long-winded explanation for why I have this on my mind, I guess. Another example of long-term decision-making would be taking a card which immediately enables your deck, like an Empty Fist, versus taking a card which contributes more to your deck's strategy later, like a Talk to the Hand, assuming that you believe that Talk to the Hand is a stronger card later in a Watcher run, which sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, in my opinion. Another one could be taking a card which angles toward a late game strategy you believe is strong, like Recycle, versus taking a card which is immediately powerful at the moment, like a Doom and Gloom. And there are the italics here because Recycle isn't necessarily actually like the strongest late game strategy to pursue as defect. The reason that you'd care about Recycle in general as defect is that it enables a bunch of infinites, which let you win runs where you don't have other types of scaling by just creating infinite block and damage once you've recycled other cards out of your deck. So trying to make Recycle strong as late game strategy on defect centers around having a lot of card draw. Cards like Compile Driver and Cool Headed are both commons on Defect, so that card draw is immediately available to you. And then Defect has a very simple infinite with Turbo, Recycle, Compile Driver, Cool Headed. That's 3 commons and 1 uncommon, which creates infinite damage and a block as long as you have a little bit of focus. So this is conceptually a very accessible late game strategy if you can find one recycle. All the other stuff you needed was like common, or like there are a number of ways that you can find a little bit of focus to make it so the block is enough. Or you could even like throw in a force field to have block instead of relying on the Frost Orb evokes. But having said all of that, there are other ways to win late game as Defect. And so when you take Recycle early as Defect, it's not necessarily a particularly strong card right now, and it's not necessarily the case that it is the best way to win late game either. And so that adds like another level of variables to the decision versus just taking a card which is immediately powerful at the moment, like just taking a Doom and Gloom, which is just like, that's just going to be a useful damage card for a lot of the fights right now, perhaps. There's another sort of trade-off, but I wanted to just mention it because it has a lot of similar analytical difficulties, and I felt like it would be worth bringing up on this slide. Taking event rooms and hoping for an event you believe is especially strong, you can compare that to taking fight rooms and thinking that you can make do with a variety of potential card rewards. And there are a lot of similarities between that and long-term versus short-term decision making. Also quite a lot of differences. But like choosing between event rooms and hallway fights can also be very difficult in Slay the Spire for sure. I want to stress, for a lot of these decisions, we don't know which is better. Like we as in anybody. If anybody says that they know which is better, like they can have that opinion, but there is stuff in here which is just like mathematically impossible to know. Slay the Spire is intractably complex. It's not solvable by human players. And decisions like these are among the most challenging in the game to answer satisfactorily. So the Spire is just a really, really big game. You reach a point where Slay the Spire is more complex than chess at the whale. Like before you go to floor 1 and shuffle your deck the first time, you already have more possible situations in a Slay the Spire run at the whale when you select your whale bonus than you do in all of the chess games in the possible universe. And chess is intractably complex. So Slay the Spire certainly is. If somebody's trying to tell you that they've solved Slay the Spire, they are wrong. Human players have found comparable amounts of success on both sides of many of these decisions. A lot of the time when we are talking about something like this and some people are choosing one thing and some people are choosing another thing, it's because people have had success with both choices. The game's well balanced such that a decent amount of the time both options are very close in overall value. And as such, it's very hard to identify making short-term or long-term decisions as wrong. And often in my experience, the ways that runs develop on either sides of these decision points are very different from each other, such that it's very difficult to intuit all of the changes that will follow from small changes to your approach. So some small thing like a belief that you should start taking Dark Embrace around about a floor like 3 or 4 on Ironclad after you've put one good damage card in your deck, let's say, versus a belief that Dark Embrace is not a priority until perhaps after you have a deck which can successfully beat the Act 1 boss or something like that. I don't know. Whatever. I'm just kind of making these ideas up. It's not like they are hypotheticals, right? But if you play Dark Embrace in those two ways, it will drastically change everything else about how you're playing Ironclad. The card's a very impactful card to have in your deck, or to not have in your deck, and its existence massively changes the values of other cards, like the obvious ones like Intimidate and Seeing Red, where it's like, yeah, of course, like the cards which are energy neutral or positive and exhaust are going to really benefit from also drawing a card when you play them. But also other stuff like Pommel Strike or Battle Trance, like the other ways to generate card draw on Ironclad, become less important if you're taking Dark Embrace very, very high. Um, Cards like Second Wind or Corruption, things which interact further with exhausting cards in your deck, change in value if you're taking Dark Embrace very highly. What I found actually was that Corruption went down in value if I was taking Dark Embrace very highly, which is kind of wild. But what I found was that I was able to exhaust my deck in other ways because of the abundance of card draw that I had, such that Corruption just wasn't as important as it used to be. And also, I found that the ease with which I was exhausting my deck consistently was making something like a Rage Infinite a lot more appealing. And Rage Infinite breaks if you have Corruption because you can only play Rage once before it exhausts. So, yeah, the ways in which the card pool has values in it change when you make decisions like this slightly differently are very hard to see from a long way away without actually having played a bunch of runs like this. I want to just give you some examples. I've already mentioned several of these. One example would be removing a card in Act 1. I recently stopped trying to play Act 1 as like greedily and started actually trying to win in Act 1 a bit more, which resulted in me like winning a lot more of my runs, which wasn't like very surprising to me, but I think that one of the reasons that I won a lot more of my runs, like more runs than I ever had before, was that I had spent a lot of time playing Act 1 very aggressively and seeing how that allowed me to play later on in the game. I feel like that was very useful for understanding late game strategies better. But anyway, card remove in Act 1. I just like, honestly, card remove in Act 1 was one of the main reasons that I eventually stopped playing Act 1 so greedy, because I was just like going to shops before elite fights in Act 1. And instead of making myself stronger for the elite fight, I was removing a strike or a defend, and then I was just dying to the elite fight. Not every time, but like with more regularity than I would have liked. And eventually I was just like, this is too bad. I am going to stop doing this. But as an exercise, some pros of card removing in Act 1 are that it makes it easier to draw good cards you find later. And by the way, I'm not saying never card remove in Act 1. I'm just saying like I was doing it too much. Anyway, it makes it easier to draw good cards you find later. It makes infinite strategies more accessible. It reduces variance in later fights and reduces complexity of later fights. I have seen people mistake the idea of reducing complexity as being useful if you're not interested in playing well, which isn't true. Reducing complexity is good if you are interested in playing well, also. Reducing complexity makes it so you are less likely to make mistakes, whether you are trying really hard to play well or not. Yeah, it's, easier to win if it's not very, very, very complicated to make your plays on every turn correctly. Often, card remove in Act 1 does make a deck better immediately as well, but it can run into problems in some fights. But like removing basics is generally going to be desirable in Slay the Spire. Some cons, though, it costs gold or other resources. Removing strikes can actually be bad, especially against Gremlin Knob, and removing defense can have diminishing value later. Something like Corruption Dark Embrace, or Dexterity on Silent, or via Kunai on Watcher. All of these things can actually make it so defend is like a pretty decent card, and you'll sometimes be sitting in a run thinking, gee, it would have been a lot easier to win this run if I hadn't spent 75 gold in my first floor and removing a defend. Card remove very clearly doesn't make you stronger as quickly as buying better cards does at the start of the run. Like, buying a Hemokinesis is so much better at making you stronger than removing a defend is. Card remove is also counterfeited by Pandora's Box, which, like, it actually does kind of matter. You get offered Pandora's Box about 20% of the time, and in my opinion and experience, you should be taking it not that much less often than 20% of the time at the end of Act 1. think that Pandora's Box is a strong enough relic that I deliberately build my deck in a way that lets me take Pandora's Box happily at the end of Act 1s when it's offered. And so yeah, the fact that like, you spent 175 gold to remove a strike and a defend, and then you just transform over your basics anyway, does kind of feel unfortunate. Also gets counterfeited by the Bites event in Act 2 to some extent. The Upgrade All Basics event is a lot less good if you've been removing your basics than if you have them. So card remove in Act 1 makes events a little bit worse in Act 2, but like the game's very, very complicated. The reason that it says some pros and some cons instead of all of the pros and all of the cons is that I don't know all of the pros and all of the cons, and even among the ones that I do know, that they're not going to fit on slides for you, unfortunately. Like most of these decisions I could talk about with somebody pretty easily for an hour plus. So yeah. Okay, next one, Dark Embrace before damage in Act 1. So like actually taking Dark Embrace over something like an Anger or a Carnage or something before you even have enough damage to kill Gremlin Knob in an Act 1 where like you're pathing into Gremlin Knob. Also like Hexaghost can be pretty tough for Ironclad to kill, and so sometimes it can, even if you have some damage in your deck, it can feel kind of sketchy to be taking a Dark Embrace over a good damage card in the Hexaghost Act, just because the scaling solutions for Hexaghost can be pretty hard to find. Ironclad does not get them in every Act 1 by any stretch of the imagination. Some pros of Dark Embrace before damage in Act 1, in my experience. The immediate obvious one, it addresses a major problem in Ironclad's long-term card pool. It has limited access to card draw. Ironclad just has less access to card draw than the other characters unless you're taking Dark Embrace. If you take Dark Embrace every time you see it, Ironclad's card draw is actually great. But if you are not taking Dark Embrace for like perhaps a third of the run, you're drastically reducing the percentage of the time that you're going to have a Dark Embrace in your deck. Dark Embrace is actually okay against sentries, and it's inoffensive against Lagavulin, which is nice. Ironclad has a lot of powers that relate to exhaust, like I said, like Evolve, Feel No Pain, Dark Embrace, and Fire Breathing. I would say are all completely fine powers against sentries, and then Lagavulin gives you 3 turns to set up, so it's not so bad to take them against Lagavulin either, which means that if you're trying to get greedy with powers like that, you're only really looking out for Gremlin Knob, which can sometimes be solved by a potion. I feel like I haven't stressed this as much as I should have yet, but like a lot of this stuff, like having a fire potion will change whether you're meant to make a greedy play or not. Because like sometimes it's just, well, how do I beat Gremlin Knob? And if you don't have a fire potion, it's like, well, I can't, so I guess I don't get to take Dark Embrace. Whereas if you do have a fire potion, you're like, well, I will use fire potion for that. Welcome to the team, Dark Embrace. So another pro of Dark Embrace is that it massively improves many other cards which aren't always strong straight away, but which may be good late game, like Seeing Red, Intimidate, Second Wind, and etc. When I started taking Dark Embraces on a floor 1, I started feeling like I was building late game Ironclad decks starting on a floor 1, instead of like building an okay Ironclad deck for the first act and a half, and then switching into trying to find some sort of scaling for late game. And I think that in the last 2 years or so of playing Slay the Spire, since patch 2.2 came out, the game has felt like player buffs have reached a critical point where the distinction between building a deck which can survive early game and then flipping to composing an engine inside that deck which can let you win late game, or trying to bridge the gap between having a value deck which can survive early game to having a deck which also generates enough value to win late game, which can be a little bit tricky without doing something with an engine or something broken. It feels like that distinction has broken on possibly every character except Defect to me. Ironclad and Silent both received significant damage buffs, and I don't think Watcher ever really had that distinction. So it kind of feels like that's only a particularly relevant distinction at that point on Defect. or at least it's less of a relevant distinction on all of the characters than it was in even 2.1, but especially in like 1.0. In 1.0, I like was thinking about silent runs as almost two separate runs. Like you make a deck that can make it through the first half of the run, and then you make a deck that can survive the last half of the run. Was kind of how I was thinking about silent runs. And then in 2.2, it started being more like I begin to make a deck which can win the entire run on floor one. And taking Dark Embrace on floor one as Ironclad is kind of the same principle. And I don't consider that to be because I've gotten better at the game by any stretch of the imagination. I think that the balance of the game changed such that building decks with specific solutions for threats early in the game stopped being particularly important, and you can instead solve early threats just by building like an okay core of a deck, which then evolved into a deck which could win late game as well afterwards. Anyway, some cons of taking Dark Embrace before damage in Act 1. It's very bad against Grumble Knob. It's quite bad against many hallway fights as well. So this is a choice which is going to deal you a decent amount of damage over the course of Act 1. It also pushes your run heavily toward exhaust synergies, although this may be where you usually want to end up anyway. There are other things you can do as Ironclad, though, that are not draw a billion cards with Dark Embrace. I also think there's some anti-synergy stuff with Snecko Eye if you're going to couple it with indiscriminately picking up cards like Warcry. And just in general, if you're taking Dark Embrace very high, the extra card draw provided by Snecko Eye becomes a lot less valuable. And the randomization of card costs provided by Snecko Eye can start to feel like a deterrent rather than a benefit. Dark Embrace Ironclad decks are often going to have lots of low cost skills in them, both because like when you add draw a card to that skill, it becomes a much better card if it costs 0 or 1. But also because a lot of the time in my experience, a way that they generate block is by using something like Rage plus lots of attacks, or by using lots of low cost skills plus something like Corruption or Second Wind or Feel No Pain. And so these things I have not found to line up very well with Snecko Eye. And so like taking Dark Embrace earlier than I used to has almost single-handedly pushed me away from Snecko Eye on Ironclad, which is actually a thing that I'm really happy about because I really felt like Snecko Eye was starting to cap out on its potential at Ascension 20 in patch 2.2. And what I mean by that is that Snecko Eye limits your card pool a decent amount. You end up skipping a decent amount more with Snecko Eye than you do with other relics because, well, a lot of the cards that would cost a 0 or 1 usually become pretty bad if they cost an average of 1.5, which just means that the number of cards you can click on in card reward screens goes down. And so because of that, it feels like you are subject to a decent amount of variance in card reward screens with Snecko Eye and in shops with Snecko Eye, which you're not subject to with other boss relics. And then within fights themselves, if you don't have card draw, usually the extra card draw that you get from Snecko Eye becomes a very valuable counterpiece to the variance increase from randomizing costs of your cards. You're just not actually more exposed to variance with Snecko Eye if you're drawing 2 more cards than usual per turn, because the 2 more cards per usual per turn that you're drawing are covering for the variance that is increased by the energy costs changing. But if you are able to build a lot of card draw into your deck in Act 1, that really feels like it stops being true. Like if you are regularly taking pummel strikes and drop kicks and dark embraces and yeah, maybe even sneaking evolve into your deck sometimes, it does start to just feel like Snecko Eye is giving you extra variance. Snecko Eye also limits your late game win conditions a little bit. you start caring a lot more about the 3-cost rare powers and a lot less about things like just building a dropkick infinite, which can be done with uncommons. So yeah, I'm not upset that taking Dark Embrace really early has made me take Sekoi less, but it is something that happened. And I wasn't really expecting it to happen all that much because conceptually to me, Dark Embrace, Corruption, Snekoi is an incredibly powerful trio of things for Ironclad. Like conceptually to me, I will win the run usually if I get those 3 things. But I wasn't expecting to find that Corruption just wasn't actually as good as I thought it was going to be if I was taking Dark Embrace extremely early. A long time ago, Dark Embrace was the rare card and Corruption was the uncommon card. And when they got flipped, I feel like for like 2 or 3 years, people were always telling me like, remember when Corruption was uncommon? Every time they saw a run where Corruption like super popped off and won the run for me really hard. And I feel like increasingly, I was saying like, well, yeah, but Dark Embrace used to be rare, and now Dark Embrace is uncommon. And actually, if you're looking at those 2 cards, it's not like that clear to me that Dark Embrace is weaker than Corruption is. Um, and I'm starting to like feel that a lot more than I used to, especially with like a growing appreciation for something like Second Wind. Um, Dark Embrace just kind of feels stronger than Corruption to me at this point, and Corruption is not in a place where I am picking it on floor 1, so yeah, um, that makes Nekoi feel a bit worse to me, I guess. I don't know. All right, anyway, that's a lot of talking about Dark Embrace. Dropkick. Dropkick is early game damage. I used to hate taking Dropkick early, because it's just so bad against sentries, and it's so bad if you don't have the ability to vulnerable something, and it's just like a card that is actually dealing less damage than Strike, which is in your hand. But, uh, well, I started doing it more, and actually I've found a lot of success with it. So, some pros of taking Dropkick as early game damage. It's actually quite good if you can apply vulnerable. Like if you're playing against an enemy that is vulnerable, yeah, like Dropkick's good. This is probably unsurprising, but we'll say it. Dropkick opens infinites as a late game solution and potentially also as a solution to the Act 2 boss. In fact, I even had a run where I got a dual wield as well, and I was able to kill Hexaghost in an act which I don't think I had a Hexaghost kill in, by hitting dual wield on dropkick multiple times in the fight and just ending up with like 5 or 6 dropkicks in my deck and getting to play 3 or 4 dropkicks a turn as Hexaghost got angrier and angrier. So, there are some things that you can do with dropkick even in early game. It potentially bridges the gap between early game need for damage and late game appeal of an engine by providing both at once, which is a really cool thing. And there's a note at the bottom here, see also Blood for Blood, which I think has a lot of similarities. I've started valuing Blood for Blood a lot more highly in Act 1, and part of that is because of the buffs to the self-damaging cards. Chemokinesis, for example, got a lot stronger. I think Blood for Blood also got a lot stronger. I think the numbers on it went up by 4, which is like a massive amount. But also because I've been trying to build Act 1 solutions in a way that scales more easily later on to the game. And something that I noticed about Blood for Blood was if your deck has like a couple of pummel strikes and a Blood for Blood in it, that's actually enough damage to win every fight in the game. You no longer have to care about scaling with strength. You don't have to worry about damage from relics or like a Juggernaut with exhaust triggers or anything like that. You can actually just play some pummel strikes and Blood for Bloods and you will kill everything, including the heart. So, and Dropkick also has some synergy overlap with Dual Wield, which I have grown to appreciate. Dual Wield's an interesting card. It can do some really nice stuff. It can be pretty awkward to take in Act 1. So having something that enables it early can let you do some pretty creative things in your runs, something that I've appreciated quite a bit. On the other hand, some cons of taking Dropkick is early game damage. It can be awkward if you can't apply vulnerable, which can be difficult in an early deck. Worth noting, this has some synergy with card remove, so it's possible that when I stopped card removing as heavily in Act 1, Dropkick actually got significantly worse, and I may stop liking Dropkick as much in Act 1 now that I've toned down how aggressively I'm playing it. I don't know. Also worth noting that like having a vulnerable potion in your potion belt makes Dropkick a much better pickup. Sometimes you can take cards based on the potions that you have in Act 1. Keep in mind that the cards you take in Act 1 are not necessarily meant to be good against like Time Meter. Often they are meant to be in your deck so that you can get through Act 1 and perhaps the start of Act 2, but you are not necessarily expecting them to be responsible for you beating the end bosses. And so something like a potion, if you have, say, a liquid memories, then it becomes much more appealing to take a bludgeon. And that really can just be that liquid memories gets better if you have a bludgeon in your deck, and you don't really have to think about it that much more than that. Just that one extra bit of output can be the difference between skipping a card and taking a card, or like picking one card over a different card. Yeah, so, vulnerable potion makes dropkick better. Sort of an obvious thing to say, but maybe something that you're not thinking about. Another problem with dropkick as early game damage is it does close off some other damage solutions like Juggernaut and Body Slam a little bit. There are some damage solutions for Ironclad which don't care that much about applying vulnerable. And if you are going to build a deck which doesn't regularly make the enemy vulnerable, which I think is absolutely a thing that you can choose to do, Dropkick is going to be a pretty bad card in that deck. Like, you've basically made a worse strike at that point. Fortunately, you get bailed out a bit by Shockwave existing. You're probably going to want Shockwave in your deck just for applying weak and stripping artifact charges anyway, which means that enemies are going to end up being vulnerable quite a lot regardless. But yeah, it's a consideration. Also, I don't think that Juggernaut and Body Slam are like premier Ironclad damage. Like, they're something that you're expecting to kill enemies with more than half the time that you're playing Ironclad or something like that. I do think that they do pretty well and should be a moderate consideration in how you're constructing your overall Ironclad strategy, but I don't think that they're that huge a deal. It's also often just a worse early game damage card over other cards that you're taking it over, and one thing that I think is important to note is that it's important to be able to spend 3 energy on damage in Act 1, like especially against Gremlin Knob. It's pretty important to be able to kill one of the sentries quickly. It's pretty important to be able to deal damage with 3 energy worth of cards against like Hexaghost and Slime Boss and Guardian on certain turns of those fights. And so for all of those reasons, taking damage cards which let you dump energy into damage has a bit more appeal to it in Act 1. And the upside of Dropkick, where like it can cost 0 energy, sometimes like that's not always that big a deal for you with an Act 1 deck, where you can't necessarily then spend that energy on something useful on a turn where like Gremlin Knob is attacking you and you can't play skills profitably anyway, so half the cards in your deck are actually bad to click on, stuff like that. All right, one more example. Disarm as early game block. Disarm as early game block is a really interesting one for me because as I tried to play Act 1 greedier, you might think that means you took Disarm more often to, take advantage of the fact that it scales for late game against multi-deck enemies or something, right? But what I actually found was that as I played Act 1 greedier, I didn't need a card like Disarm as much for middle and late game enemies, and so I actually started liking taking it less, which is extra surprising given that I was taking Dark Embrace all the time. But I was just finding that if I reached a point where I was up against mid and late game enemies, I was more likely to be like absolutely murdering them on turn 1 or 2 with some ridiculous combo, or going infinite against them with infinite block, or just like going way over the top of them with generating like 200 or 300 block and having a barricade in play or something like that, such that Disarm just like didn't matter that much. And so because of that, the fact that it is a middling card at best in Act 1 just meant that I wasn't actually that interested in taking it anymore. Some pros, though, for Disarm are that it's a good card against Hexaghost and Guardian, but it's worth noticing that it's not that good in many other places in Act 1. It was like okay against Lagavulin. There are some spots where it's like fine, but yeah, it's just not that good. It is, however, an excellent card late game and in several Act 2 fights, like Book of Stabbing, for example, against birds, it can be very good. And in some sorts of decks, like value decks which don't look for infinites, it's one of the best possible defensive cards in Ironclad's card pool. It can reduce the incoming damage from the heart by 45 pretty easily, and over the course of the Time Eater or Awakened One fight, it can also greatly reduce the amount of damage that they are dealing to you. But some cons of it as an early game card are that it's terrible against Gremlin and Slime Boss and usually bad against sentries, it doesn't deal damage, and it's countered by artifact charges. So for all these reasons, it isn't necessarily a great card to be taking in the early game. I thought the Disarm was really interesting. Yeah, like I said, I was expecting to be like, oh, I'm playing greedy. That means I take Disarms in Act 1 so that it can benefit my mid and late game decks. And then instead, I just found that by playing greedy, I was building mid and late game decks that didn't like having Disarm as much as I wanted. Lowering my priority of corruption because I wasn't finding that it was actually as good as I thought it was going to be with Dark Embrace is probably part of that. For what it's worth, I still think I still take corruption very high and stuff. I'm just regularly the thing is that I'm regularly finding that I'm in situations where I already have a win without corruption, and that win without corruption is actually kind of reliant on playing a card like Second Wind or Rage multiple times. And so even though taking corruption would be very strong, it's actually taking away my already solved win for the run, and isn't clear that I can find a different win every time, and so I'm not taking it. So Disarm is a card where I wasn't liking taking it in Act 1 because I was regularly reaching Act 2 and 3 and finding that it already won, and Corruption's kind of the same way, where I'm regularly reaching at 2 and 3 and finding that my deck already wins without needing to have Corruption. Being able to take Seeing Red early because you have Dark Embrace is contributes to that as well. Corruption helps you with energy and a strategy which doesn't care as much about building for Snecko Eye and does get to take cards like Seeing Red and Intimidate early, doesn't care quite as much about generating energy. It also gets to take Runic Pyramid higher, by the way, which I really like. So, anyway, in conclusion, I hope all of that was interesting. I just kind of felt like talking about Ironclad cards for a bit, I guess. But yeah, back to the original thing that I was actually talking about with short-term versus long-term decision making. If a card is usually good late game, but is bad on floor 1, it follows logically that there is usually some point between floor 1 and late game where it starts making sense to take it over many other options, right? Like, if it's bad on floor 1, but good on floor 50, probably somewhere in the middle, it passed the point of don't take into the point of do take. But it's very difficult to know exactly where that point is, especially because it will change situationally in every run you play. Sometimes it will pass that point on floor 10, sometimes on floor 40, sometimes never, sometimes floor 1. So one of the most challenging things, in my opinion, about all of this is that mistakes on both sides of the decision can be relatively close in value while wildly different in execution. So neither waiting until floor 20 nor waiting until floor 30 is necessarily a large mistake if you're meant to take a card on floor 25, but each option can lead to massive changes in how you play a character. And because of that, there can be massively different solution spaces with significantly different understandings of strengths of different synergy packages and stuff like that, which actually end up just having around about the same win rate overall, despite being massively different. And I think it can be easy to end up talking past each other, where you are evaluating one card a certain way and not recognizing that the core reason that you're evaluating it differently from other player is that they are evaluating something completely different from you, differently from how you are. And overall, the difference between your two strategies isn't actually very much in terms of win rate, even though you're using vastly different synergy spaces to achieve that win rate, which ends up being, not that different. So I think that all of that is really interesting. and I wanted to make a video about it, and now I have. um, yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I'll see you next time.